Welcome back to the Rundown. Well, as we mentioned before, Israel's elections are fast approaching. And the matter of election financing is hot on everyone's lips here, with democracies around the world struggling to find that balance, to balance the impact of campaign donations, legitimate, with limiting big money impact on the democratic process. Our Asher Westropp-Evans takes a look at Israel's approach to campaign finance.
Show me the money. In the wake of US elections, which saw record levels of dark and outside money flooding the system, now it's Israel's turn to head to the polls. So, in the lead up to the April 9 vote, I-24 News sat down with economist Erez Zadok to find out the inner workings of how Israel regulates its own election process.
First source is the budget from the government. Parties gets $280,000 for a year for every seat that they have in the Knesset. Second, and existing parties have a specific budget. It's about $370,000 for each Knesset member that they have. Third source is donations and trustees. The fourth source is members' fee.
How much does an election cost to run here in Israel?
$3.6 million in trustees and $1 million in donations. Every seat in the Knesset worth $370,000. So you should take $370,000 times 120 Knesset members.
For comparison, the 2016 US elections cost a whopping $6.5 billion. With the vast majority of party funding for Israeli elections coming from government financial support, in Israel there is a vigilance to donations coming into the system.
We have full transparency. We know exactly who donates who.
So many countries have problems with corruption, dark money, outside money coming into their election systems. Is this a problem here in Israel?
It's not allowed to use foreign funding. I mean, the only one who can give donations to Israeli parties are those guys that vote in Israel.
But Israel is not totally immune from the issue of interest group money entering the system.
That's what the problem is. And another problem is when non-profit organizations are running campaigns during the election time.
While it may not be necessary to have money to run in Israeli politics, it is certainly helpful to get you to the top.
If you are not able to raise money, maybe you are not a very good politician.
So, while the political game in Israel seems to be less about who has the most money, there is undoubtedly a fierce battle being fought for the hearts and minds of Israeli voters.
Well, our Asher Westropp-Evans now joins us in studio. And Asher, very interesting piece. But I want to switch focus now to another interesting story you're working on. That concerns the Trump administration's trade policies. And when we've talked about it, it's usually in context of how they affect those big countries and markets like China in the EU. But somewhat surprising, Israel, too, may now be facing the impact of that Trump approach to trade.
Exactly right, Kalev. Next week, Bloomberg and others are reporting that the U.S. trade representative is going to be sending envoys to Israel to work on a trade negotiation that has been going on since the Obama-era administration, which could greatly affect the current system of free trade that exists between the U.S. and Israel. Now, to give a little background and context to it, if we take a look by numbers, the U.S. is by far Israel's greatest trading partner. Approximately 30% of all exports from Israel go to the United States, far ahead of any other trading partner that Israel has. And now, the two countries have had a free trade agreement in place since the mid-1980s, but Israel, a highly protected country, coming from socialist roots back when it started, along the kibbutz movement, other such movements that had a strong socialist lilt. It's moved towards a much more free market in the last several decades, but still has strong protections, particularly in its agricultural sectors and farming sectors, which the US doesn't have, and now, under the Trump administration, feels that there's a disbalance between the sort of free trade, the capacity for free trade between these two countries.
And indeed, the issue of the farmers, and as you mentioned, this is an ethos that goes back to the kibbutz, is very strong in Israel, isn't it? And that's a very tricky political subject for any government in Israel to remove those protections.
Certainly right, Kalev. And we're seeing that play out in the current elections. We've just had leaders of the blue and white party, Benny Gantz, go up into the north in Israel, go to the farming areas, the farming belt in Israel, and assure farmers that he is there to ensure their protection. This is something that goes back, and we see that reflected in both the left and right on Israeli politics. The eagerness to ensure Israeli farmers have continued protections against a wider market to make sure that Israel has a sense of sustainability, something that, as you said, goes back to their kibbutz-era ethos, that idea of self-sustainability and Israel being able to protect itself from being reliant on outside forces or countries.
And let me ask you, Asher, if for example, the U.S. were to get Israel to lower those trade barriers to imported fruits and vegetables, how would that play out both for the consumers and the farmers that we're discussing?
Well, certainly if the U.S. does manage to achieve its goals and get Israel to lower some of those protections, the consumer would probably be better off. And Israel, which has had protests in the past about the cost of living, your average consumer would probably be quite happy to see free market enterprise, more goods enter the market at a lower cost. But for the farmer, it would probably drive many Israeli farmers out of business who simply can't keep up with the economies of scale of larger countries such as the U.S. and farmers there.
You know, it's a tough trade-off because as an Israeli consumer, anybody who goes to the markets here will complain about the price of be it strawberries or tomatoes or whatever it happens to be. On the other hand, protecting the farmers here means you get fresh fruit and vegetables. Like you said, it's going to be a tough dilemma for this government or whatever the government comes after the election. Asher Westropp-Evans, thanks for joining us on The Rundown.